Hello and welcome to Twist List. Today we are looking at 10 sibling soldiers who fought on opposite sides. War is always devastating. Particularly unfortunate, however, is when it destroys families. Sometimes, for reasons of ideology, politics, honor, emotion, or simple geography, siblings can find themselves on opposing sides of a war, or even facing each other over the same battlefield. The fifth spot on the list is occupied by American Revolution. The Nepalese Civil War saw Maoist revolutionaries attempt to overthrow the country's monarchy. It was a rousing Maoist speech promising equality and freedom from discrimination that drew Juna Rai into the rebel cause in 2003. At the time, she was only in the 8th grade, and she left without telling her father. The following year, she was almost killed by a grenade that left her with a deep leg injury. In 2006, photographer Sagar Shrestha snapped a picture of Juna huddled over in the cold, tightly clutching her rifle, a photo which became emblematic of the country's war weariness and fatigue. It was only in 2009 that it was discovered that Juna's brother Bhuvan was in the Royal Nepal Army and that both had participated in the battles of Bhojpur and Dikdal. After being interned in the Udaipur cantonment in 2009, Juna reconnected with her brother, overcoming the indoctrination that she had experienced. As of 2013, Juna and 1,422 other internees were inducted into the Royal Army, and she is now proud to serve in the same institution as her brother. Number 4 on the list is Ralph and Edmund Verney. The Oka family migrated to the United States in the 1920s and ran a hotel in California before returning to Japan due to adverse economic conditions. In 1937, however, the three eldest children, Isao, Masao, and Chikara, Don returned to the States and were drafted after Pearl Harbor. Due to their Japanese language skills, they were placed in military intelligence, with Isao transferred out of the distinguished 442nd Japanese American Regiment to eventually serve as the voice of American propaganda from the Philippines, which included reading the Potsdam Declaration, the terms of Japan's surrender. With Masao limited to garrison duty, Don was the only one of the three to see active duty. He fought on the island of Tinian, where he unsuccessfully pleaded with starving Japanese soldiers to surrender. Don's service on Tinian also included being dive-bombed by his brother Takeo, a pilot for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Tragically, Takeo, an elementary teacher before the war, was shot down and killed on his flight back. Tiji, meanwhile, was conscripted by the Japanese army in the desperate days of 1945, only to be wounded when his troop ship was sunk en route to Okinawa. After the war, we have two more brothers who were too young to face conscription, returned to the United States and joined the military intelligence service fought between the pro-Soviet MPLA and the US-backed UNITA, both of whom were willing to make use of child soldiers. While his parents and younger brother fled into the forest, Amaral, the elder brother, was taken by Anitu as a teenager. Here Luis experienced near starvation and the abduction of his mother before he was forcibly conscripted by the MPLA in 1987 at the age of 14. Rising quickly through the ranks, Luis soon found himself commanding a unit of 10 tanks and 150 men, even though he was still a teenager. This was rooted in 1991 when anti-tank fire took out 9 tanks and all except 30 of the men. Luis survived by hiding in his sole surviving tank for several days. Understandably, Luis jumped at the chance to leave the army during a ceasefire the following year. He studied nursing and now works for several charitable foundations. It was only in 2004, after a separation lasting 30 years, that the brothers met again, with Amaral, who had lost a leg to a landmine, sending a letter from a Zambian refugee camp. Upon their reunion, Luis was shocked to find that the anti-tank missiles which had so devastated his unit had been handled by his brother. At the second spot is Nepalese Civil War. The Scottish Campbell brothers emigrated to the United States in the 1850s. James set himself up as a drayman and clerk in Charleston, and Alexander worked as a stonemason in New York, although he occasionally joined his brother further south. Both joined local militia companies. This meant, however, that they were swept onto opposite sides when war broke out. Even though they kept up a relatively amicable correspondence, it was over control of James's adopted city that the two brothers very nearly met in combat, with the Battle of Secessionville stemming from the Union's attempt to retake Charleston. In the first attack on Fort Lamar, Alexander, as color sergeant of the 79th Highlanders, stormed the parapet and placed the Union flag there, holding his position in the face of prolonged musket and cannon fire until ordered to withdraw. James was among the defenders and stiffened Confederate resolve at a critical time by mounting the parapet unarmed and hurling a log into advancing Union troops. In the aftermath of the battle, which was won by the Confederacy, James coolly wrote his brother, "I was astonished to hear from the prisoners that he was color-bearer of the rebel that assaulted the battery at this point the other day. The sons of Hitler's
He also said that if they met again, you have but to discharge your duty to your
William
cause,
was
for I
born
can
in
assure you
Lois,
I will
moved to
strive
England
to
and
discharge
married an
my
English
duty
woman
to my
in
country and my
1911.
cause." Lois abandoned this family to return to Germany in 1914, presumably due to World War I, where he got married again. Heinz was born to this second marriage in 1920. After Adolf Hitler's rise to power, William was invited to Germany to take a job in a bank. When asked to relinquish his British citizenship, William wisely fled to the United States, where he criticized his uncle's regime and claimed that mental illness ran in the family. Adolf started calling him "my loathsome nephew." William's half-brother Heinz, meanwhile, was his uncle's favorite nephew. He loyally joined the Wehrmacht, although he was later captured by the Soviets and killed in 1942. The United States Navy was eventually induced to accept William after he wrote a letter to the president. He attained the rank of pharmacist's mate before receiving an honorable discharge in 1947. Following the war, he changed his name, and his 3 sons now live quietly in Rhode Island.
The 5th spot on the list is occupied by effective recycling program. For a country that had huge issues with environmental contamination, the Soviet Union and its puppet states had a large-scale recycling program for their citizens. In the 1970s, Soviet leaders began to set up recycling services that were extensive for the time, even if most people took a while to use them. 20 Soviet cities had major recycling plants for paper, with almost 30% of all paper recycled in the Soviet Union during the 1980s. Compared to the 270 kilograms, 600 pounds, of paper used by Americans per capita in 1989, people in the former Soviet Union only used about 10 kilograms, 25 pounds, per capita that year. This was partly due to the Soviet culture of reusing material. Soviet citizens also had access to glass recycling centers that sometimes paid them to return glass bottles. During the Soviet regime, plastic was rarely used in consumer goods. Plastic bags did not appear until the 1980s. Number 4 on the list Soviet years, people reused their bags or used their own containers when shopping strategy was a strict plastic of Western colonialism. Uncommon. With most this bottles made they spent money and time aiding third world countries in their battles for independence against the average citizen and compared the Soviet Union provided most of this aid to countries in Africa, which worked to gain freedom from colonial forces through most of the Cold War. Aid often took the form of weaponry and technical help for warring nations. One of the most profound examples of help occurred when the Soviets provided support for India's independence. The two countries forged an alliance that continued throughout the Cold War and allowed India to stay independent. Some politicians and historians disagree on whether Soviet anti-colonial aid was a good thing or a bad thing. But it generally allowed these countries to gain independence that they otherwise would not have achieved. The dark side of this aid was that Soviet foreign policies were just as colonial as Western policies. They often treated countries in their Central European zones of control as Soviet colonies. In hindsight, the colonial aspects of Soviet foreign policy are clear. But it is also clear that the Soviet Union helped many countries to gain their independence from other colonial masters. At the third place we have effective industrialization. Before the rise of the Soviet Union, Russia was mostly an agrarian country that did not have an effective industrial economy. In this way, it lagged far behind other countries in Europe. However, one of the most important things that the Soviet regime did for its country was to bring it into the modern world. During the Stalin era, the Soviet Union underwent a massive industrialization process. The minor economy of the Tsarist era was transformed into an industrial powerhouse that rivaled other First World countries. All of this happened in the 10-year period from 1928 to 1938. Overall, the Soviet Union industrialized at a faster rate than any other country previously had, which improved the lifestyles of its citizens. Between 1929 and 1934, the Soviet Union achieved a 50% increase in industrial growth and an average annual growth rate of 18%, which was an unprecedented leap in output. Of course, the news wasn't all good. Many products manufactured in the Soviet Union were of low quality. But industrialization helped the USSR to become a first world country. Former Soviet states like Russia and Ukraine became effective world economies. And the second spot is free education. The Soviet Union emphasized education, especially in science and engineering. Soviet law guaranteed all citizens a free education regardless of their social standing or income. Unlike other countries at the time, this education extended to college and postgraduate work. Some people received their doctorates without paying tuition. The education plan covered all costs of attending school, including textbooks and school supplies. The Soviets also built universities and extended the possibility of education to developing republics in the USSR where education had previously been unavailable. For example, Belarus had no universities before the Soviet Union existed. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Belarus had 22 universities. The effectiveness of the Soviet education system is clear from the number of great scientists and mathematicians that came out of the country. And finally, at number 1, drug-free neighborhoods. Throughout its history, the Soviet Union had strict drug control, which became more repressive over time. This was the opposite of the trends in the West. Soviet policies focused on criminalization of drug use and did not do much with drug rehabilitation or addiction recovery. But it did result in essentially drug-free neighborhoods. Soviet politicians and writers considered drug use to be a decadence caused by capitalism. As a result, the Soviets went to great lengths to stop any drugs, including the full list of drugs catalogued by the UN Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances. This included strict bans on opiates. Of course, there were still drug users in the Soviet Union. But their number was incredibly small, mainly confined to elitists and people in prison. Both groups got their drugs from gypsies who smuggled them into the country. In the 1980s, the Soviet government had much more difficulty controlling the influx of drugs, which caused a surge in the drug culture. Most of these new users were young people who saw drugs as a way to imitate Western culture.
Thanks
Increased drug use also came from
this
Soviet soldiers returning from Afghanistan, where they
button.
first took illegal narcotics. When the Soviet Union fell, the drug control laws did as well, leaving Russia with the narcotics problem that it has today.